A monster storm out in the middle of the Pacific just kicked into an entirely different gear. What was a violent typhoon less than 24 hours ago has now crossed the threshold into super typhoon territory, and the numbers coming in are honestly staggering. Today is Thursday, the 30th of July, 2026, and I want to walk you through exactly where Dolphin stands right now, how fast it got here, and what this next stretch of intensification actually means for everyone watching this storm, whether you're out in the islands or simply tracking this because of how historic this system is shaping up to be. There's a lot of chatter out there right now, some of it accurate, some of it wildly overblown, and I want to cut through all of it and give you the real picture based on what the data is actually showing at this moment. Let's start with where things stand right now, because the change here has been dramatic. Dolphin has completed that eye wall replacement cycle we were watching yesterday, and the storm came out the other side exactly the way these systems often do when the environment around them is this favorable, stronger than before. We're now looking at sustained winds of 160 mph with gusts reaching as high as 195. That officially puts Dolphin into super typhoon status, the equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane, and one of the most powerful tropical cyclones anywhere on the planet this year. The storm is currently sitting a few hundred miles east of the Mariana Islands, still tracking west-northwest, and it has actually picked up a bit of forward speed compared to yesterday, now moving closer to 11 mph. What's remarkable here is just how quickly this jump happened. We're talking about a storm that went from a fairly modest plateau during that eye wall cycle to a full-blown top-tier super typhoon in less than a day. That kind of rapid intensification is exactly what happens when a storm moves over water this warm with virtually nothing standing in its way. And that's precisely the environment Dolphin has found itself in. Sea surface temperatures out ahead of the storm remain in that 30 to 31 degrees Celsius range, some of the warmest water anywhere in the basin right now, and wind shear across the region remains remarkably low. When you put those two ingredients together, warm water acting like rocket fuel and a calm upper atmosphere that isn't tearing the storm apart, you get exactly what we're seeing with Dolphin. A system that is not just strengthening, but strengthening explosively. Satellite imagery right now shows a textbook picture of an intensifying super typhoon. We're looking at a small symmetric eye, extremely cold cloud tops surrounding it, meaning the thunderstorms wrapped around that eye are punching incredibly high into the atmosphere, and a nearly perfectly circular structure with no dry air intrusion or shear disrupting the system from any direction. Meteorologists refer to this kind of presentation as annular, essentially a storm that has built such a thick, well-organized ring of intense thunderstorms around its core that it becomes remarkably resistant to the usual factors that weaken tropical systems, storms that take on this annular structure often hold onto their peak intensity for much longer than a typical system, which is exactly why forecasters are watching this so closely right now. So where is the storm actually headed? And just as importantly, where is it not headed? This is the part everyone wants clarity on, because I know there's no shortage of pages out there making it sound like every single island across the Pacific is directly in the crosshairs. That's simply not what the data shows. As of this moment, Dolphin is expected to continue on that general west-northwest heading for the next couple of days, staying out over open water the entire time. It's being steered along the southern edge of a subtropical ridge of high pressure that continues to sit over the central North Pacific. That ridge is acting almost like a guide rail right now, keeping the storm locked onto a fairly consistent track. Here's the part that matters most for people out in the islands right now. Based on current guidance, Dolphin is expected to pass well to the northeast of Guam and the northern Mariana Islands, staying a comfortable distance offshore rather than making any kind of direct run at them. I want to be straightforward here because I know how much unnecessary panic gets stirred up by exaggerated headlines. Unless something meaningfully shifts in the pattern over the next day or two, the core of this storm, meaning the most destructive winds near the eye, should stay out over open water rather than tracking directly over land in that region. That said, outer rain bands and rough surf will still be a factor for those islands, even with the center passing offshore. So this is not a moment to completely tune out if you're in that part of the Pacific. Where things get genuinely uncertain is further down the line, once Dolphin approaches the waters closer to Japan. Model guidance remains split on this, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend there's more certainty here than there actually is. A portion of the ensemble members are leaning toward a track that eventually threatens southwestern Japan. Areas like Kyushu and Shikoku, potentially bringing the storm into the vicinity of some significant population centers and military installations in that region. Other model runs keep the door open for a track that continues further west, which would put the storm on a path closer to China instead. We are still the better part of a week out from any of that actually resolving, and a lot can and likely will change between now and then. I always like to remind people just how much natural uncertainty builds into a forecast the further out in time you look. A forecast for tomorrow or the next day is generally quite reliable at this point in the storm's life cycle. A forecast for 5, 6, 7 days out should be treated as a general zone of concern rather than a precise line pinpointing exactly where landfall might occur. That's exactly why nobody in that broader region needs to be making firm decisions today based on a forecast this far out. What does matter is staying engaged with updates as the picture sharpens, because it absolutely will sharpen considerably over the next several days as reconnaissance aircraft and additional satellite passes feed more data into these models. Let's talk intensity trend going forward, because this is genuinely one of the more remarkable aspects of this storm. Given that annular structure I mentioned earlier, along with the exceptionally warm water and low shear environment out ahead of the storm, forecasters are calling for Dolphin to either hold at its current peak intensity or potentially strengthen even further over the next 24 to 48 hours. We could be looking at sustained winds approaching 165 to maybe even 170 $1 at the very peak of this cycle. To put that number in perspective, that places Dolphin firmly among the strongest tropical cyclones recorded globally in recent years, the same tier that includes only a small handful of storms in any given season anywhere on the planet. Eventually, as Dolphin continues tracking toward the waters closer to Japan, it will begin moving over progressively cooler water. An increased wind shear is likely to start affecting the storm's structure as it curves more toward the north. That typically works against a tropical system's intensity, and there's a reasonable chance we see some gradual weakening in that final stretch as a result. But that transition is still several days away, and right now, in this exact moment, the trend for Dolphin remains unmistakably one of continued strength, if not outright additional intensification. I want to take a moment to explain why storms like this sometimes hold onto their strength far longer than people expect. A lot of viewers assume that once a storm reaches its peak, it simply starts weakening from that point forward. But that's not how these systems actually behave. As long as the surrounding environment remains supportive, meaning warm water beneath the storm and minimal shear working against it from above, a system can essentially maintain its peak intensity for an extended stretch, sometimes for several days in a row. It's only once that supportive environment starts breaking down, whether from cooler water, increased shear, or interaction with land, that these storms typically begin to weaken. Right now, Dolphin still has a fairly long runway of favorable conditions ahead of it before any of those weakening factors are expected to come into play. Let's shift over to the broader wind field, because this gives you a real sense of just how large and powerful this system has become. Dolphin's wind field has expanded noticeably over the past day, meaning the area experiencing tropical storm force and typhoon force winds now extends considerably further out from the center than it did even yesterday. This matters because a storm doesn't need to make a direct hit on a specific location to produce meaningful impacts there. Rough surf, dangerous rip currents, and gusty winds can extend hundreds of miles out from the actual center of a system this powerful, which is exactly why islands positioned even a comfortable distance from the projected track are still worth keeping an eye on. Now let's take a broader look across the rest of Asia, because there's plenty happening beyond Dolphin alone, and we never want to leave anyone out of the picture here. Out toward Yap and Palau, moisture continues streaming through with periods of heavier rain, and that same moisture plume continues lifting northwest toward Hong Kong, where additional rounds of rain are expected over the next couple of days. Up across Luzon, scattered showers remain likely, with the better chance of heavier rainfall continuing further south toward Mindanao, particularly around the Davao area, where some locations could see meaningful rainfall totals build up over the coming days. Across Cambodia and into Vietnam, the pattern remains active as well, with sizable pockets of monsoonal moisture continuing to stream across the region. It's worth remembering that a lot of this widespread rain isn't necessarily a direct product of Dolphin itself. Much of it reflects the ordinary rhythm of monsoon season across South and Southeast Asia, though a storm this large and powerful sitting out in the Western Pacific can still subtly reshape the broader flow of moisture across an enormous stretch of the map, even reaching areas thousands of kilometers from the storm's actual center. Heading toward the end of the week, Taiwan is worth watching closely, with increased rain chances building in by Friday and continuing into the weekend. Cebu is also likely to see periods of showers as moisture continues. Lifting northward and back over toward Guam, there remains a small disturbed area of moisture sitting just off to the southeast that we'll continue watching to see whether it tries to organize on its own, though all the major attention right now remains squarely on Dolphin given how quickly it's intensifying. Now, let's swing over to the Bay of Bengal for a moment, because there's a separate system there that deserves attention, even though it isn't likely to become a household name. This area of disturbed weather continues showing early signs of organization, though the timing here works against significant strengthening, Even if a regional weather agency ends up officially classifying this system, it's likely to move inland fairly quickly once it does organize, cutting short the amount of time it would otherwise have to build a stronger wind field. This is a common pattern for systems that form close to a coastline rather than out over open ocean, since a storm generally needs sustained time over water to properly strengthen, and a system already interacting with land simply doesn't get that runway. That said, even without much wind intensification, this system is expected to significantly enhance rainfall potential across the region. And that's really the story worth focusing on here, rather than any wind-related impacts. Systems like this one rarely make international headlines the way a major named typhoon does. But the human impact from flooding rainfall can end up being just as serious, sometimes even more so than the wind damage associated with a far flashier storm out in the open Pacific. Let me walk you through some rainfall totals across the broader region covering today through the weekend. Out across the western Pacific, the heaviest totals obviously remain tied to Dolphin itself, along with additional moisture building back toward Micronesia and swinging further toward parts of southern China. Across the Philippines, Manila could see totals reaching somewhere around 50 millimeters over the next few days, with areas further south, particularly around Mindanao, potentially picking up totals exceeding 100 millimeters in some of the heavier pockets. Scattered rainfall remains possible across the broader Mariana Islands as well, including Tinian and Saipan, with some spots potentially picking up around 50 millimeters, or roughly 2 inches, over the next several days as outer bands from Dolphin continue sweeping through even with the storm's core staying offshore. Further west, totals climb considerably once you reach southern China, where some areas could see totals topping at 250 millimeters over the coming days. Taiwan's rain chances continue building as well, with the heaviest totals likely arriving as we move deeper into the weekend. Over toward Japan, Honshu remains the area to watch most closely for meaningful rainfall in the days ahead, with totals potentially reaching 150 millimeters or more in some locations, though obviously everything there depends heavily on exactly how close Dolphin ultimately tracks as it curves northward in the days ahead. If you're subscribed, you'll be the first to know the moment there's a meaningful shift on that front. And circling back to that developing system over the Bay of Bengal, moisture from that system continues building back towards central India, where genuinely substantial rainfall totals are expected. We're talking about the potential for totals reaching 250 millimeters in some spots, with certain locations possibly topping 300 millimeters, raising a real risk of significant flooding in low-lying and densely populated areas where drainage systems can quickly become overwhelmed once the ground becomes fully saturated. So here's where everything stands right now. Dolphin has officially reached super typhoon status, currently packing sustained winds of 160 hours cm/h, with the potential to strengthen even further over the next day or two, given how supportive the surrounding environment remains. Based on current guidance, the storm should continue passing well to the northeast of Guam and the northern Mariana Islands, sparing those islands from a direct hit, even though outer effects like rough surf and gusty winds will still be felt. The far more uncertain part of this forecast remains what happens as Dolphin approaches the waters near Japan, with guidance still split between a track threatening southwestern Japan and one that continues further west toward China. We have time before that resolves, and the picture will continue sharpening considerably over the next several days. I also want to remind everyone that a forecast like this represents a living, evolving picture rather than something fixed in stone. Every update from official forecasting agencies gets refined continuously as new data rolls in, whether that's fresh satellite passes, reconnaissance flights directly into the storm, or updated computer model runs. That's exactly why we keep returning to this story day after day, rather than posting a single forecast and walking away from it. A system as powerful and as dynamic as Dolphin can shift in meaningful ways with very little notice, and the only way to stay properly informed is to keep checking back in as those changes unfold. So that's everything I've got for you today on Super Typhoon Dolphin and the broader weather picture unfolding across Asia. There's a lot of ground we covered, and I appreciate you sticking with me through all of it. Drop your questions down in the comments, and thank you to everyone out there sharing these updates in group chats to help get accurate information into the hands of the people who genuinely need it, whether that's about Dolphin specifically or any of these other developing systems bringing significant rain and flooding risk to different corners of the region. I'll keep you posted as all of this continues to unfold in the days ahead. Have a really good and safe day ahead.